Add Nantucket to the list of Massachusetts locales with recreational pot shops now up and running. The Green Lady Dispensary opened Sunday after getting special dispensation from regulators to be allowed to test their products on site instead of at a licensed independent lab like mainland marijuana retailers have to. So while figuring all that has to be one hurdle for retailers and regulators alike, there's still plenty more to tackle 2+ years since voters decided to legalize, like how do you police for people driving under the influence of pot? And should there be protections for employees whose companies are still looking to crack down on use of illegal substance? Joining me are Shaleen, one of 5 members of the state's Cannabis Control Commission, who also co-authored the ballot question that brought us legalized marijuana. Good to see you. And by the way, she is here as an individual, not as a member of the commission. I'm glad you came. Matt Allen's the field director at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Hey, Matt, good to see you. Blake Mensing is founder and chief counsel at the Mensing Group, which bills itself as the first and only legal and business advisory firm dedicated solely to cannabis in Massachusetts. Good to meet you, too, Blake. Let's start with workplace problems. Bernadette Coughlin was here in June of last year talking about how she felt right after she was fired by her company. Here she is.
I can't even, I've never been fired in my life. Honestly, the first thing that I thought about were the kids that work for me because we were like a family there, like a real family. Sorry, we're like a real family there.
As I'm sure you know, she fell, she broke bones, she tested positive for drugs, even though she was not impaired and hadn't used the vape pen since the weekend. Stan Hoffman, the chair of your commission, just totally coincidentally was here the same night. And while he said he was sympathetic, his contention was the commission has no jurisdiction over issues like this. It's a legislative thing. Is that your position as well?
That's right. The commission doesn't have any control over this. But I do really commend Bernadette for speaking out about it because I do think it's time to evolve. When cannabis is legal, if a worker is using it in the evenings or in the weekends and it's not affecting their job, it shouldn't. They shouldn't be punished for that.
And we should be clear to people at home. I assume they know this stays in your system a lot longer, which is why it's an issue than alcohol does. So Senator Jason Lewis, who was co-chair or something of the commission that looked into this before you guys existed, before the law was passed, has a bill. What does it do, and does it do it the right way, Matt?
Well, what Senator Lewis's bill would do is protect people who use marijuana on their off time but aren't at work impaired. And I think it makes sense. You know, it's time for employers to get in step with the voters of Massachusetts who said, let's regulate cannabis like alcohol. So as long as you're not, misbehaving at work or actually showing up to work impaired, what's the point of penalizing workers? There's no evidence that workers who use cannabis are less effective or productive than others.
I haven't read his bill, but I assume he makes an exception to that criterion for people whose jobs are, like truck drivers and those sort of. Am I right about that?
Yeah. So certain areas where there's an emphasis on public trust. So think nurses, doctors, firefighters, policemen, things like that, where obviously there's a little bit more stigma attached to being a consumer. That would probably not be protected under Senator Lewis's bill.
As I'm talking to these two guys, I realize, why didn't you put this? You were involved in the drafting of the law. Why isn't it in the law? So we didn't have to wait 2.5 years and have the Bernadette Coughlins of the world and others lose their jobs for reasons they probably shouldn't have. Why isn't it in the law?
You're totally right. That's a great question. It probably should have been in the law, but that's part of a ballot initiative, is you have to anticipate what people will think about it and address it. But Senator Lewis, who originally opposed that law, has now come out to try and prevent this type of discrimination and make sure people are treated fairly, which I commend him for.
By the way, even though he opposed it, he told me here that if he had been able to draft the ballot question, whatever that means, he would have voted for it. He wasn't against legalization as such, at least so he told me. He was against some language, whatever it was, in this question. How are other states dealing with this issue? Like Lewis's bill would do, Matt? Is that what's happening or no?
Well, we've definitely seen an evolution in protections in state law for medical marijuana patients. But when it comes to recreational users, there's really not protections across the country right now.
In other states that have legalized, for either of you, if other states have legalized marijuana, there are not these worker protections that we're talking about doing here? There are?
There are several.
Like this, like the Lewis proposal?
Yes. I know that Senator Lewis's office talked to many other states about their protections, and there are probably 10 states that protect patients in the workplace, and those states have not seen any increase in workplace accidents or absenteeism.
By the way, I'm entitled, I believe in my contract, to one stupid question a night. Why does this not pass in 30 seconds? I mean, who can possibly, even if you're opposed to legalize marijuana, you lost. It is the law of Massachusetts. Who is against? Is there any company that opposes these kind of protections for its workers? If you're not impaired, you're not impaired. End of discussion.
I think it's a vestige of 80 years of federal propaganda telling people and society at large that this is a harmful drug both to the individual human and society at large. And I think you can't legislate away that stigma, and it's going to take some time. But I think the metric should be performance at work. If you go home and you smoke weed at night and you do your job well, it, in my opinion, shouldn't be at issue at all.
Is it the expectation, that this is going to pass? It's just a matter of time, like almost everything in the legislature? Does anybody have any different impression or whatever? Okay, let's move on to one I think is a little tougher, driving under the influence. This time it's not Jason Lewis, it's the governor who has a bill. And it seems to me the governor's proposal is dependent on people called drug recognition experts, increasing the number from somewhere in the hundreds to somewhere in the 300s, amongst cops kind of thing. You were the only person on some sort of commission looking at this who was not happy with the recommendation. What's your problem with this?
That's
and
correct.
By the way, what would these DREs do? I should have asked.
Drug recognition experts are police officers, and they've gone through a training that is supposedly enables them to be able to determine who is on drugs or not. But my concern, and what I spoke out against as a member of the Operating Under the Influence Commission, is that this drug recognition exam is not based in science and evidence. It's not been validated using standard scientific methodologies, and hasn't been peer-reviewed, and I don't think it even would be able to be published in a reputable scientific journal.
Why is that any different
today.
from what you just endorsed for an employer? Observe their employee. If the employee is impaired, then you take action against them. If the driver appears impaired, and by the way, this cop is far better trained than some employer is trained to recognize whether their employee is impaired. Why is one okay and another one is not?
Well, there's definitely a difference anytime we're looking at the actions of people in the private sector versus giving state actors expanded powers to actually penalize drivers and take away their rights.
Both of you started me, do you have problems with the governor's proposal?
Absolutely. I do.
Well, you start there, okay.
So yeah, I think
what's your problem?
The issue is the lack of scientific reliability. So with alcohol, there's a blood alcohol content that tells you something about someone's level of impairment.
But there's no breathalyzer test.
No, and I believe the scientists and R&D folks are working toward that. But someone can have metabolites of THC in their system 5 weeks after they've smoked cannabis.
So while they're working on the breathalyzer for marijuana, what are we supposed to do with somebody who drives when they're high and cause? I don't want to be hit by somebody on the road with that person. What do you do about
Jim,
that?
it's not like officers can't do anything under the law as it stands. They can absolutely take away the keys immediately from a driver.
If you're reckless driving or something.
And when they get to court, they can testify about any characteristics that a common layperson would understand represent intoxication. Being unsteady on their feet, slurring their speech, being slow to react.
Well, isn't that exactly what this drug recognition expert is going to look at?
Well, the governor's bill would do two things. First, it would confer the status of expert on these DREs.
So they'd be expert witnesses in court.
Right. They basically become...
They're pre-qualified, essentially. Is that how it works?
They would be considered a medical expert according to the law. We think that decision of who's an expert or not should be really left up to judges. But also, the governor's bill would penalize drivers who didn't take the test. So right now, with the
like if you don't take a breathalyzer.
Exactly.
Were you on this thing?
I was not. I did attend several of the meetings. I think that it was a very thoughtful approach that avoided some of the earlier mistakes that some other states had made.
The governor's approach you're talking about.
Yes. So some of the earlier states were so panicked and wanted to do something that they ended up criminalizing THC being in your blood, which has nothing to do with impairment. So this commission started really looking just at impairment. That was off the table. But I do think when we're looking at something like taking away a person's driver's license for refusing a test, that test needs to be scientifically validated.
But I think the consensus is, I'm not sure the governor would agree with this, that it's not scientifically perfect. But let me ask the two of you, the bookends here, what else do we do? Is Matt's answer the answer, that the cops have enough power under existing law to police this? Is that
absolutely? Yeah, I think, as Matt said, if you can judge someone's performance on the road, it's sort of parallel to what I was saying in the workplace context. The problem is subjectivity, and I think the danger here is that the people who were disproportionately enforced against under prohibition are going to fall victim to the same mentality by the police that led to that disproportionate.
And by the way, you were the one who was the champion of exactly that concern about communities who were disproportionately affected by pre-existing laws. Do you share the concern that, I mean, you seem to be supportive of Baker's approach. Do you not worry about discriminatory enforcement here when there's so much discretion?
I think that when we add any any new policy that's taking away liberties in particular, we have to make sure that the problem that we're solving is clear. And I think we also, this seems obvious, but I think we also need to make sure we're tracking who is being stopped by law enforcement, who's being arrested, look at that and demographics, and then compare it against whether we're actually reducing injuries and deaths related to impairment.
We only have a couple seconds left. You on the commission took a vote that I think is long overdue. I'm really glad on pot cafes. I know you don't call them that. Social consumption sites and on licensed deliveries. The public has the opportunity to comment on that. Till when again?
So they have until this Thursday at 5 p.m. If you go to masscannabiscontrol.com, you can send written feedback, or you can come to a hearing in Boston or in Springfield.
And this gives, since there's so much less capital investment, the opportunity to deal with what you were so concerned about, social equity, is embedded in these proposals.
It is, and the Commission has voted to exclusively give those license to those groups for the first 24 months.
Terrific. Good to see you all. Thanks so much. Good to meet you.
Thank you kindly.
Good to meet you.
Appreciate it, Jim.
And great to see you again. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.